But following the war, we reached agreements, and these agreements define our boundaries, and we and they have agreed that they may not be changed except by mutual consent. But much more important, even than history and law, is this basic moral question. Here we are, 8,000 square miles, perhaps the smallest state in the international community. Here they are, 11 sovereign states, 3 million square miles, 400 times our area, and we have the fantastic doctrine. I will admit it isn't sponsored by any serious government, but one does hear it, the doctrine that this vast, sated, fat, huge, lavish Arab empire should expand at the expense of tiny Israel. Nobody in the world need lie awake at night worrying about whether Israel is too big.
When you talk about the huge, sated, fat Arab states, the 11 sovereign states, it is barely possible that you're guilty of some overstatement. There is also in that area tremendous poverty, tremendous desolation.
Yes, I'm speaking, Mr. Wallace, purely in territorial terms. They really have no reason to envy us, our 8,000 square miles.
Mr. Ambassador, do you foresee further territorial expansion by Israel?
Well, I don't like the word further, Mr. Wallace, because, as I've said, our present boundaries rest upon agreements beyond which we have not encroached. But we certainly do not desire to expand our frontiers. I doubt the reality of this issue. We are prepared to accept a guaranteed settlement with the Arab states on the present frontiers. Are they so prepared? I wonder whether the issue isn't one of Arab expansion. Here sit I, the accredited representative of Israel, and I declare that Israel will sign a peace treaty with the Arab states on the present frontier. Now, you get an Arab ambassador sitting here to say that he will have a settlement with Israel on the present frontier, and you'll really have a story.
Of course, there is one political party, and a fairly substantial political party within Israel, the Herut Party, with 15 seats in your parliament to the Ben-Gurion Party's 40 seats. One of the Herut's major spokesmen, Dr. Joseph Shechtman, wrote this recently. He said, Zionism is more than Israel. For Zionism, Israel's present territory and population are but a partial accomplishment, and the Herut Party is dedicated to territorial expansion. Is that not so?
Yes, but when you've said, Mr. Wallace, that they have 15 members dedicated to expansion, you're really saying, in other words, that there are 115 members not dedicated to expansion. In other words, 85% of the Israeli electorate has put its trust in parties which do not advocate territorial expansion. Therefore, I think one can say that within our democratic process, the concept of territorial expansion has been rejected.
Let's move along. Recently in the Middle East, I spoke with the president of the National Bank of Egypt, Hussein Fahmy, who's a member of the Egyptian Economic Council, and he told us this. He said, Israel as a nation is doomed to go bankrupt because the resources are pitifully limited, some olive and orange groves, a little potash, no fuels, no raw materials to speak of, and its industry, he said, is unable to make enough products to export at a significant profit. Israel can exist only on charity from other nations. What's your answer?
Well, I'm deeply touched by this gentleman's concern, but I will say with a definiteness which may surprise you that there is no reason whatever for any skepticism about Israel's economic future. Let me just say what the main facts are, which build up into a certainty of success. Take 7 years, 1951 to 1957. During that period, our population has increased by 4% per year. In other words, by some 30% in 7 years. Population increase of 30%. What has happened to our national product in those 7 years? It has increased by 75%. What has happened to our export trade? It has increased by 250%. From a figure of $75 million a year export earnings in 1951 to $203 million export earnings now. In other words, all the trends, all the lines are converging towards success, and we think that our difficulties are transient. These are impressive, basic facts.
They are impressive facts, but the fact of the matter is that the balance between imports and exports is still way in favor of imports.
Oh yes, there is a very imposing deficit in the balance of payments. It becomes less imposing if you analyze it.
The New York Times...
It includes, if I may just
surely
refer to this, all the machinery that we're importing, all the capital goods, all the tractors, the machines, the irrigation pipes to make our economy productive, these are all included on the deficit side.
In other words,
We're
you're
like
furnishing your
yes,
house, so to speak.
We're like a man who's furnishing a workshop. While he's building the furniture and the equipment, of course his expenditures are heavy, but he's incurring those expenditures in the cause of ultimate fruition.
The New York Times summed up your economic problems at the end of '57 in this fashion. They said the trade deficit remained between $300 million and $350 million, which meant that for another year, Israel continued to depend upon the astronomical contributions of world jewelry, and particularly United States jewelry, to keep her head above water. We're now faced here with talk, at least, and probably the fact of a recession. Were there to be a serious recession, not only here in the United States, but in the world, this could be disastrous for Israel, could it not?
Well, we do depend for this transitional period in which our economy is being built upon external aid, and of course if we were cut off from that aid, we would suffer, but we would not be alone in that. Our economic future depends on very clear guiding posts. Agriculture. We can become independent of all agricultural imports except a few staple products. Minerals. To give you an example, we're earning $1 or $2 million a year from our potash resources. This could become $15 million for that single item. Industry, where we're opening new markets in Asia and Africa. And science, where we look to the new fuels and the new forces of nature to compensate for our relative scarcity in conventional fuels.
Talking of America's involvement in all of this, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the United States finds itself on the horns of a dilemma. We want Israel's survival and friendship, but we also need the friendship of 40 million Arabs who might otherwise turn to Russia. Do you think that it is in the United States' best interest, therefore, to befriend Israel and risk thereby losing the entire Middle East to Russia?
I think, Mr. Wallace, that your country's only course, if I might suggest it in response to your invitation, is to follow a policy of constructive friendship for Israel and for the Arab states. America has sponsored and stimulated the independence of many Arab states. You would have been false to your own traditions of justice and equality if you would enable them to become independent in 11 countries and not enabled our people at the climax of its agony to achieve its modern domain of independence. I think that if your policy makes it clear that you seek the friendship of Israel and of her neighbors, not at the expense of each other, and that you regard these friendships as reconcilable within your policy, I believe that that would be respected by us and by them.
You don't believe that friendship for Israel on the one hand and the Arab states on the other are necessarily mutually self-canceling?
I think not, Mr. Wallace, and many countries manage, as your own country does, to reconcile these two elements in its policy.
Ambassador Eban, in a moment I would like to ask you about the role of the American Jew in Israel's and Zionism's future. According to a leading anti-Zionist here in the United States, Rabbi Elmer Berger, the Zionist Israeli axis, he says, imposes upon Jews outside of Israel, Americans of Jewish faith included, a status of double nationality, which he charges is both artificial and dangerous. In a moment, I'd like to get your opinion of that charge. And we'll get Abba Eban's answer in just 60 seconds.
Now, Parliament with recessed filter is best.
Best is the word for this new hi-fi Parliament. Over 30,000 traps. No other popular cigarette delivers less nicotine and tar. And because this filter is recessed, trapped nicotine and tar can't get on your lips. Let me demonstrate with this chalk. Just take any other filter cigarette. Chalk the filter, like this. Then Parliament's recessed